I have a lot to live up to with the word perfect in that introduction. Thank you very much for that. Yeah, it's a good introduction too, because what I'm going to be doing with you tonight is an application. It's an application of psychoanalytic thinking onto stuff that's going on in culture, in society. Is anybody familiar with the Goldwater rule? Heard about that in relation to Donald Trump? Some people nodding their heads, some not so much. The Goldwater rule is a ruling by the American Psychiatric Association that came up in, I think, in 1964 when Barry Goldwater was running for president. And one of the major magazines interviewed, I think, 20 psychoanalysts to give their reading of what was wrong with Goldwater. They were old-style psychoanalysts talking about mother complexes and anal fixations and repressed homosexuality. And they got in big trouble for it. They're making lots of assumptions based on very little information. Think about what information you could get from a public character in 1964. So the American Psychiatric Association, for fine ethical reasons, said the psychiatric profession should not be making statements about people that they haven't met themselves, and if they've met them, then it's a confidential relationship, so you shouldn't be making those statements anyway. I do happen to be an American, but I'm not a psychiatrist, so the Goldwater rule doesn't apply to me. But I will, in a sense, stick to the spirit of it, because I'm not going to be diagnosing Donald Trump here. I am going to be doing two things: applied psychoanalysis, so we'll learn a little bit of psychoanalysis by looking at Donald Trump, and I think we can learn something about Donald Trump by thinking about him psychoanalytically. Barry Goldwater didn't have Twitter. Yeah, Barry Goldwater didn't have 24-hour television. We have data and access that we've never had before, so we can come to some sort of understanding. Trump lies at the extreme end of, I think, some psychological functioning, and we can also learn across the spectrum by looking at what happens at the extreme end. So I'm going to make a start. If anybody has any questions, just put up your hand and I can clarify, and there will be time for discussion and questions at the end also. I should probably state my bias. I'm not a big fan. Yeah, so I don't think that stops me from being able to access what's going on there. I could have called this Inside the Dangerous Mind of Donald Trump. I think he is dangerous, and I think some of the things we're going to cover will show why I think there's a danger there. I think we could probably say interesting psychological things about most of our world leaders, but we're stuck with this one. So the first question I want to say is where do we start, right? Usually, I've done this talk a couple of times, and what I do is I take his most recent crazy shit and use it as my first slide, but the most recent crazy shit happened today. So I didn't have time to update what happened today. Does anybody know what happened with Donald Trump today? Yeah, if you play the stock market, you would know, because it's gone down, I don't know where it finished the day. Don't know what time it hasn't finished the day yet. It was down about 1.5% when I left home. Trade wars are good, he said, and they're easy to win. And he slapped a 50% tariff on steel imports to the US. Also managed to tweet about Alec Baldwin and spelled dying wrong in his tweet, and how he saved Alec Baldwin's dying career. So this happened today, right? WTF, I think, is the expression that we're going to be kind of engaging with here. So what is this about? So we started this is the slide I made last week after the really tragic events in Florida. Some of you may be aware of this. This was the crib sheet that Donald Trump had in his hand when speaking to the students at the Florida shootings. And this one, I hear you, he's supposed to say, right? This is the most basic empathic response. Right? You train to be a counselor, you train to be a psychotherapist. Listening skills, active listening it's called. You want to communicate to someone that you're taking on board what they're saying. This is the President of the United States, number 5 on his cheat sheet, with a bunch of people who've just been traumatized at a school shooting, is I hear you. What would you most want me to know about your experience? What can we do to help you feel safe? Okay? This is empathic coaching for this guy. And no matter what you think about George W. Bush or Bill Clinton, they kind of had a knack for empathic reasoning, for connecting with people. Trump has a way of connecting with people in a different way, but you wouldn't necessarily call it empathic. So what else does he do? He tweets. And these are the tweets. Because they're tweets, you have to read them from the bottom up. That just followed the Florida shootings, right? where he suggested that if teachers had guns, we wouldn't have these kinds of tragedies. So he says, I never said give teachers guns, like was stated on fake CNBC, or CNN and NBC. And then he goes on to explain what he really said is, don't give teachers guns, give them concealed guns and make sure they're really good shot before you give them a gun. And then he justifies himself. And then he says, basically it would keep us safe because if they had guns, they could fire back if a savage sicko came to a school with bad intentions. Highly trained teachers would also serve as a deterrent to the cowards that do that. I'm not going to go through all of them, but he's also saying, really great deterrent giving teachers guns. Now, what is interesting about these tweets isn't necessarily just the content. Yeah, it's kind of around this, I never said give teachers guns. So we have yet another national tragedy involving guns. He gets criticized for his off-the-cuff remark, which he's so used to making, and then he goes into a full-throttle defense of himself. Yeah? And we're going to go through ego defenses shortly, but just as a little taster. So first is denial. Yeah, I never said give teachers guns. Then he takes down the opponents. So ad hominem attack, fake news, it's not real. Then justification. And then basically black and white reasoning. And we're going to go through these piece by piece. But I believe you can find quite a lot of psychological information in what he's sort of throwing out into the world at the moment. This was the fourth one. Also, we want to look at the difference between what we call sickos, in a sense, sicko shooters, talented teachers, and cowards. Okay, again, we're going to go into this in a little bit more detail, but we see a lot of black and white reasoning when in Trump's words. There's very little gray area ever, whether it's about immigrants, whether it's about building walls, whether it's about alliances. We're not talking about an alliance-friendly person. And I'm going to go into why somebody might move into what we call dichotomous thinking. Technically, we're going to get into it. It's called paranoid schizoid positioning, which is a term that psychoanalyst Melanie Klein came up with. But you see it all over the place. And I have had the great displeasure of looking through the Trump archive online of his tweets, and there are lots of them. And you can really see tons and tons of this. I mean, it's as if he took a psychometric test via Twitter, and then we can then analyze it. Okay, but is it fair? Can we really do psychoanalysis by tweet? So this great Trump archive sorts out tweets according to various topics, suggestions, or words. So Trump has said so-and-so doesn't have a clue quite frequently. He said it about all of these people. Hillary or Barack, neither of which has a clue. Okay. So again, we find interesting positioning, right? These people don't know. It's not an engagement of ideas. It's a dismissal of other. It's making the other into an object. Top 6 mentions on Twitter since becoming president. Who does Trump talk about, or who does he Twitter mention the most? Fox and Friends, which is the television show that highly praises him every single morning, that we know from very good evidence he sits and watches. He has tweeted their report seconds after they've reported it. It's like this crazy amicable relationship between the Fox network and Donald Trump. So he's bigging them up quite a bit. He's supporting them. He tweets himself second most, most frequently. He tweets the White House, Fox News, POTUS, President of the United States. So we're looking here at the top 5 mentions. 1, 2, 3 of them are him, and 2 of them are his best friends in the media. Okay, so you can draw your own conclusions from that. This is a basic quantitative analysis of his tweets. He does speak to his wife as well, Flotus, First Lady of the United States. She gets number 6. Okay. It makes me feel so good to hit sleazebags back, much better than seeing a psychiatrist, which I never have. Okay, if only he had. So, again, we see the back and forth, yeah? The sleazebags, and it makes me feel good. We're going to keep coming back to this. He's getting it off his chest on Twitter, yeah? He wants to hit them on Twitter, and he wants to get his own end. It makes him feel good. Okay, so we need to talk about Donald Trump. What's going on? How can we access what's going on in his mind, and then what might we be able to learn about ourselves and our culture as we do so? Okay, so to be really clear, I'm not talking about mad or bad. So a lot of the criticism that's coming from the APA with the Goldwater rule is that if we say that Donald Trump has a mental illness of any sort, if we use diagnostic labels, then in a sense what we're doing is we're smearing mental illness with badness. Yeah? If he's bipolar, then everybody with bipolar is terrible. My argument is you could be mentally ill, have a mental illness or not, and you could be mad or bad either way. Yeah, you could have personality disorder or not, and you could be mad or bad either way. Nothing says that if you suffer with something mentally, that makes you a good person or a bad person. We're all people, and we struggle with different psychological functions. But we can talk about character, yeah? And I would like to talk about character. What is in a personality? What creates a personality? Why do people behave the way that they do? Characters lean towards good, lean towards bad, and a whole variety of different circumstances and contexts. We're going to be talking a lot about ego psychology, and I mean this in a technical way, yeah? So what is it about an individual's ego? Very simply, the ego is the I in us. It's how we understand our subjective selves, how I am in the world. And the ego has a very particular job, at least in old-fashioned traditional psychoanalysis, which is to mediate between the inner world and the outer world. So to mediate your id, to mediate your disorganized bits, to mediate your unconscious out there in the civil world so that we can get our unconscious needs met through civilized interaction. So it's kind of the part of us that makes the whole of us behave. Not always a little bit better, but that's kind of its aim, to meet the challenges of the real world. And we're going to rely a lot on ego psychology today. We're also going to think a bit about group psychology. So how did this man end up in the White House? What's going on in social media? What's going on with the interest? Why are people like me talking about Donald Trump? We're going to start with character and personality. So, as I just started to talk about, we have a self, which is inclusive of pretty much everything you want to include in a self. So that includes the body, that includes beyond the body, all of our memories, all of our dynamics, unconscious and conscious, all of our imagined relationships. And then we have this ego that sits on the edge of the self. Freud described the ego as a callus that forms on the self. So, you get a callus because you're playing the guitar or you're skateboarding or whatever it is. Your skin gets thicker in its response to the real world. And the ego develops like that. We don't have an ego when we're babies, but it develops in response to what's going on in the real world. And then our character is a conglomeration of how that ego forms. And we're going to be thinking about this. This is the external world, this is the self, and this is the ego. Winnicott, great British psychoanalyst, came up with a term called the false self, which is an aspect of the ego. And he says that the false self is set up to protect the true self, to respond to challenges in the environment. The false self essentially takes up the role of social compliance. The false self is what we develop as children, basically in order to manage our parents. So if we start screaming and crying and we find out that it makes our mother nervous and she doesn't want to be in the same room with us, we might mediate our crying. We might cry less, even though our instinct, in a sense, is to cry really loud. So that mediated less crying is that false self that you put on so you don't freak your mother out, yeah? And then we do this all the time. We develop all sorts of false self. There's nothing wrong with it. It's a bad term because it's not really false. It is a mediated, creative response to an environment, but it's a little bit tilted away from what you might say authentic, immediate expression. Yeah, we change that authentic, immediate expression to be nicer, for example. Of course, it can happen the other way around. It could be that your parent ignores you unless you're screaming and throwing a fit, in which case your false self might be quite a disruptive one. So it doesn't have to be social compliance either, really. Now, like I say, there's nothing pathological about a false self, but Winnicott also said that there are those who can be themselves and those who can also act, whereas there are others who can only act and who are completely at a loss when not in a role and when not being appreciated or applauded. So what's going on here is we saw the picture of the self with the ego on top, and you imagine false self as part of that ego. So we have the self, which is the largest thing, the ego, which is slightly smaller, and then we have the false self, which is part of the ego. This is when we're in trouble, when you think that false self as part of the ego is your whole self. Yeah? You're breathing your own gas in a sense. You think that's it, that created self. The development of narcissism is a result of this, in a sense. So what happens is that the ego starts tipping outwards. That false self is constantly aware of what the expectations are in the environment, and it tips out, to understand that more, to read it and respond to it. And then it kind of inflates also. And when it inflates, it takes up more space in the psyche, and at the same time, it kind of casts a shadow within the self, so that those parts that don't fit the story of the false self, those bits that are shameful or vulnerable or unskilled, they get less playtime. And that identification starts to happen with the successful bits of the false self, the bits of self that get attention, that get feedback. Then we have the relationship to others. So the ego is always mediating relationships to others, and the false self, in ideal circumstances, the ego responds to actual others in your environment. When an ego is having difficulty, it's responding to others as if they're somebody else. So this is what transference is about. I will respond to my boss like a nasty stepfather because I had a nasty stepfather when he's actually trying to be nice. So you actually don't see the subject as a full subject. You see them as kind of an object. When the ego grows and narcissism takes over, others start to have, they get smaller. They become more like objects in a sense, because what happens to that false self, narcissism, very much contrary to what we're led to believe in a conventional sense, it's a very fragile ego manifestation. It's terrified all of the time, A, of being found out, or B, not being good enough. So if you allow others to really impact you, that's going to deflate your ego, because they're not just objects of your ego's play. Somebody might disagree with you. Somebody might be in conflict with you. Somebody might have a different idea than you have. This is the nature of everyday relating. This is how we keep our egos in check with each other. The bigger the narcissism, the smaller other people matter. They become objects of the ego. Do they aggrandize me or do they not? And if they aggrandize me, I'm keeping them. And if they don't, I don't. We saw some of those traits happening in those original tweets. We like Fox and Friends. We like the wife. We like the White House. The Democrats, not so much. Okay, so now we're going to learn about narcissism through tweets. Sorry, losers and haters, but my IQ is one of the highest, and you all know it. Please don't feel so stupid or insecure. It's not your fault. Okay, President of the United States. Okay, so, I mean, it would be funny if it weren't so tragic. Fortunately, it's a little bit of both. So, sorry, losers and haters, right? So here we see the diminishing of the other into losers and haters. They're on the wrong side. They have bad IQs. Mine is the best. End of story. Now, there is a condition called narcissistic personality disorder. We can have a whole other conversation about personality disorders and diagnostics. I like to just think about them as a collection of features. So we don't have to say this is that, but when we look at the features of narcissistic personality disorder, it's hard to see that he doesn't have quite a few of them. But I do, I am a little bit critical of some of these diagnostics, so I really am not saying that I think Trump has narcissistic personality disorder. I really don't know, and I don't really know that's a thing. But if you look at a collection of various instances that show up in narcissistic personality disorder, I think you'll see a lot of resonances. This is right out of the DSM-5, by the way, so the latest diagnostic manual. Oh, okay, I'll just give you a second to look at that. It's important to know that personality disorders in the literature, it's a bit like character. It's very different from mental illness in a sense. It's not like a mood disorder. It's not like bipolar. It's not like schizophrenia or depression or anxiety. It's like a character. It doesn't budge so much. You look at people who are in prisons, the percentage of people who are in prison who have some kind of sociopathic personality disorder is very, very high. So you have a kind of character personality, antisocial personality disorder. You have a character that is much more likely to behave in certain ways and end up in certain places. It could be prison, it could be the top of a major corporation, it could be the mafia, or it could be political leaders. So the way in which these things manifest themselves can be really, really different and land people in different places, because there are also some quite adaptive things that go on, yeah? In some ways, Trump's character has been adaptive for him, in others it hasn't. So we're going to look at his use of the word I to get a sense of his ego, his I self, in some of his quotes. I will be the best by far in fighting terror. I will be the greatest job-producing president in American history. I mean, he's not modest, you know. There's no fake modesty here. He just goes right through. I am the best builder. Just look at what I've built. I'm in Las Vegas at the best hotel by far, Trump International. And this quite famous one, I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose voters, okay? There's a little bit of truth to that, which is a little bit frightening, because he said all of this and he became the president. He keeps saying stuff and he keeps managing to stay there. So there's also a kind of feedback loop that starts happening. You know, you start to follow people, or people start to follow you in your orbit and start feeding back. You know, he thinks he could become president of the United States. He ends up president of the United States. Who's to tell him he's not the best thing on earth? Because he's dismissing any opposing feedback. But we know that when we put the cold light of objectivity on the scene, that it's not the case. That's Obama's inauguration on the left, that's Trump's inauguration on the right. One of the first scandals that happened was him being so upset that fake CNN News was reporting that his inauguration numbers were less than. This is a man who is obsessed with numbers. You think about that Winnicott statement, those who can't find themselves when they're not being applauded or lauded. This is like a serious injury to him. Yeah, that these numbers aren't showing up so much that you leap into well, we don't know if it's kind of a psychosis. You know, a psychosis is a complete break with reality, but an absolute refusal to accept some things that are going on in reality. I'm the least racist person there is, he says. This is what he said about Mexicans. Oh, there's missing a G up there. This is what he said about white supremacists in Charlottesville. Then he could see a gray area. When Nazis were marching in Charlottesville, he could say that, well, maybe there's some good in those people. Fine people on both sides. This is what he said about Africans, Americans, and Jews. And this is what he said about Muslims. So I just, you know, when you think about getting in the mind of Donald Trump, just maybe wonder a little bit what that's like to be able to say something about oneself and to be saying these things at the same time. What is that like? Yeah? To hold one statement and a completely opposing statement. What do you have to do? We've all had to make justifications for our behavior, so we all know what that's like when we're in conflict with ourselves, or I did it because something. But just, you know, hold that tension, and maybe we can wonder for a little bit about what that tension might do to someone, yeah, who's saying one thing and also saying an opposing thing. Many people have said I'm the world's greatest writer of 140-character sentences. This was obviously before Twitter increased its character count, despite the constant negative press. So this was one of his most beautiful sentences. Does anybody remember this tweet? Yeah. On ambition, he says, I wouldn't use the word ambition. To me, ambition is a bad word. When I see people saying, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that, it really sickens me, to tell you the truth. And yet this guy made a game about himself in which his signature is on all the Monopoly money. Okay? So this is a guy who, I don't know if you know this game. I hate to say it. I had this game as a kid in the 80s, and basically it's like Monopoly, but you don't know how much money is going into the thing. So every time you land on something, secret money goes into a little box. So if you end up buying a tropical island or a hotel, you get to find out how much money is in it. So it's like Monopoly, like super capitalistic Monopoly. Yeah, it's like a representation of his life. He's an ambitious man. Right? So again, we want to hold this like dichotomy, yeah? I hate ambition, I'm ambitious. I made a game after myself. Wow, the ratings are in Arnold Schwarzenegger's got swamped or destroyed by comparison to the ratings machine of myself. He's talking about The Apprentice here. This is after he's already president. So again, feeling very threatened by the potentiality that somebody on a TV show that he used to be on might be getting ratings close to his. It's not the case. So no ambition there, no sensitivity there. Pretty symbolic in his work as well. We can see it all over the place. His vice president of construction for Trump Tower, she says the public spaces were all top-notch, but the apartments, the stuff in them was a lot of crap. So what you have in Trump Tower, well, that's actually his apartment, I think. What you have in Trump Tower is the public space, which is about 3 or 4 floors in an atrium, high-end shops, lots of gold everywhere, the famous gold elevator that he and Nigel Farage were in. Top spec. You go into the apartments in Trump Tower, really, really low spec. Yeah? So it's a really good representation of false self, isn't it? What are we showing to the world? And then what's going to happen to the actual poor buggers who have to live there? They're not poor buggers, actually really wealthy, but they're getting really crap kitchen sets. Yeah? That's where the money is going to be saved, in the bits that you don't see, but in the bits that people are going to experience in every day of their life. Yeah, so there's a real kind of kick in the gut, I think, in that. We're going to show you grandiosity, but we're going to make you live in really low quality places. So we're going to show you great wealth. It wasn't the White House, it wasn't the State Department, it wasn't Father Lavar's, the so-called people on the ground in China that got his son out of a long-term prison sentence. It was me. Too bad, Lavar is just a poor man's version of Don King, but without the hair, just think. This is an event that happened now a while back where Lavar was going to be sent to prison in China, and the State Department got him out. But I just want to draw attention to it was me. Yeah, it's as if there, I can make jobs. I can stop terrorism. I get this guy out of jail. There are no teams here. So I mentioned this term before, the paranoid schizoid position. This comes from Melanie Klein, and she's describing what happens to a very, very small baby before that baby is able to understand time, consistency. So the very basic idea of this is when the baby is cold or hungry and experiencing distress, it's as if the whole world turns terrible, yeah? And then when the mother shows up and she feeds the baby, there's milk there, there's warmth, there's loving, it's as if the whole world is suddenly ideal. Now, because the baby's mind can't conceive time quite well, when the breast goes away, when the mother goes away, the world turns dark again. And Melanie Klein suggested that not only does the world go dark for this baby, but he might also feel like it's against him, gets paranoid, like he's under assault. Why isn't she, the baby is not thinking in these terms, but it's like, why isn't she here? Why aren't I being fed? This world is a horrible place. And with enough consistency, object consistency, the baby starts to learn, oh, well, that breast is going to come back, and oh, that mother's going to come back, and when she goes away, I know she's going to come back, and this is how we get consistency. This is how we calm ourselves in an ideal situation. Paranoid schizoid position is the first position. For Melanie Klein, the second was the depressive position. This is a good thing. It's called the depressive position because we also lose the ideal mother. So in the first one, it's like she's great and she's ideal when she's there, but she's a terrible monster when she's not there. Now it's like, well, she's good enough because she's here enough of the time, and then she goes away, and I kind of miss her, which is kind of depressing because I don't have my great mother anymore. I just have this mother who's kind of flawed. Yeah? We tend to, in our lives, shift between paranoid, schizoid, and depressive positions. You don't just move out of one. So if you've had a really, really rough ride, you might kind of regress back into paranoid, schizoid thinking. Yeah? So terrible week, I don't know, you lose your job, your partner breaks up with you, you're sitting at home and you're thinking everything in the world sucks and nothing is right. That's kind of paranoid schizoid thinking. And the hallmark of paranoid schizoid thinking is black and white. This is the dichotomous thinking I was talking about before, yeah? Something is either ideal and really good, or something is really, really bad. And you see the world through these black and white lines, yeah? Gray areas are very, very hard because as soon as you have a gray area, you move into the depressive position because there's no more ideal. I have to struggle with things being difficult and complex and conflictual. Donald Trump says, when someone attacks me, I always attack back, except 100 times more. This has nothing to do with a tirade, but rather a way of life. Okay? He's proud of it, really, but he's really describing what a paranoid schizoid position is. Yeah? If they come after you, get them out. You need to be on top. You're witnessing the single greatest witch hunt in American history, led by some very bad and conflicted people. Okay? He cannot see the Russia probe as sort of part of the big picture. Yeah? That actually we have a government in which there are checks and balances, and that this is their job. They become very bad people. It becomes a witch hunt. Witch hunt. It's a paranoid statement. Yeah? They are after me. It's the essence of paranoia. Trump's worldview is very dichotomous in this very way. He said the world is made up of people with either killer instincts or without killer instincts, and that people that emerge are competitive and driven with an instinct to win. So very basic Darwinian thinking here. Yeah, and then we can think about what happened today. Yeah, he sticks 50% steel. I'm not an economist, so I can't go into the details, but 50% tariffs on the steel industry. There are all these repercussions. It's a very complex world. All these repercussions sort of fly out, but he's really got his eye on one ball. Yeah, his agenda. This is why he can say something. He's recently turned around on gun control. Now, how can a guy who the National Rifle Association has loved and supported for so long suddenly say, maybe we ought to reconsider this? It really depends what room he's in and who he's talking to and who is lauding and applauding him. I don't think he's going to be a big guy for gun control going up, but you can't necessarily trust this guy for integrity of idea, because the integrity is based in how that idea is received by others. That's kind of the number one thing. This was the same woman who talked about the public spaces being finest and the private spaces not, the VP of Construction, Trump Tower. He attacked two kinds of people: weak people. He found their weakness and exploited it, and he attacked people who attacked him and came at them harder. Okay, so this is a man who is going to win. He can't stand weakness or vulnerability. He can't stand to look at it. The guy who Ghost wrote The Art of the Deal, he has a primitive worldview, very binary worldview. There are predators and there are victims. If you're not the predator, you are the victim. So you have to see, if this goes down to such a deep level, then the idea of engagement, the idea of collaboration is just a completely foreign idea. In this worldview, there is no win-win. There's only win-lose, and then you have to win. And if you're seeing everything through that, you look at all of the things that, all of the world issues, whether it's immigration or whether it's finance or whether it's gun control or the environment, we're not seeing a middle ground here. Yeah, we're seeing what is the strongest position. Get even with people. If they screw you, screw them back 10 times as hard. I really believe that. I'm not sure he does, because I think he believes 100 times as hard, which is what he said in his tweet, but you'd have to go check with him. Revenge is sweet and not fattening. Okay, this is not a man shy to share his worldview around these issues with us. Okay, in a recent book about Donald Trump, Zimbardo and Sword kind of looked at his impulsivity more than things around character or personality disorder. And impulsivity is also a trait in which there isn't a lot of control of the impulse, obviously. So the desire arises and the desire is met. So in Freudian speech, we understand this thing called the superego, which might be sitting on top of the decisions that we make, kind of saying, oh, that might be a good idea, that might not be a good idea. Why don't you think on it for a little while? When we drink a little bit too much, the superego recedes, and then we start making terrible decisions because we're being impulsive and uninhibited. Trump has shown a lot of evidence of having an impulsive personality. Quite famously, it was revealed that these are his famous, his 4 food groups. Pizza, a chicken fillet, Diet Coke, and fried chicken from KFC. It's not very healthy, clearly, but I also want to think about it from this sort of Darwinian perspective and from the perspective of the id. These, they have everything you want. Yeah, you've got the sweet, you've got the fat, you've got the fried. It's kind of a manifestation of that impulsivity. We can kind of see it across the board. He wants it now. He wants it good. He wants it satisfying. So what does Twitter offer a man like this? Yeah, the capacity to be impulsive and to get feedback from large scales immediately from his impulsivity. So it's a feedback loop. I mean, I can't imagine what your Twitter feed looks like when it is being retweeted tens of thousands of times in the seconds after you send it, when the whole world is looking. We know that there's a direct relationship to dopamine hits in things like retweets and likes on Facebook. Think about a guy who's, on the KFC and tweeting like mad. This is this serious kind of loop going on. When somebody says something about me, I am able to go bing, 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 and then I take care of it. The other way, I'd never get the word out. He's talking about Twitter here. Yeah? He's able to go bing, 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 which is the skill you want in the President of the United States, to be able to go bing, bing, bing. There isn't engagement and thought. Just heard Foreign Minister of North Korea speak at UN. If he echoes thoughts of Little Rocket Man, they won't be around much longer. Okay? Now we have an impulsive tweet to somebody else with a kind of dangerous personality manifestation in the world with nuclear weapons. So when you see the potential damage that impulsivity can have, maybe you want to think before taunting a guy with nuclear weapons across the ocean from you. Wow, Twitter, Google, and Facebook are burying the FBI criminal investigation of Clinton. Very dishonest media. So I put these back to back because you also can see, he uses these media in order to get his point across, but when he sees that these media aren't on his side, they're bad news. And he seems to be able to hold these completely binary ideas in his head at the same time. Okay, so these are a few more. This is when he released the stopping transgendered individuals from being in the military in the US, which he announced by tweet before the military or the Pentagon even knew about it, throwing everybody into a tizzy. We don't know. We don't know what this came from. We don't know why. It ended up not happening, yeah? But it was a news story for a week. Some people say he's very clever. Some people say it's a bait and switch thing, that he will tweet something like this so everybody's eyes are looking over there, while some scary stuff's going on somewhere else. I don't personally think that's the case. I really don't think he has the mind to do that. That doesn't mean that there are people around him who do have the mind to take advantage of his sleight of hand. I don't think he particularly cares. So Trump literally said this, soon you'll be calling me Mr. Brexit. This was after the Brexit vote, but before Trump got elected. I think this is possibly a revelation, and we know that there are lots of connections between the Brexit campaign and the Trump campaign, many of which I imagine he was aware of. And when he says, soon you'll be calling me Mr. Brexit, I think he's being impulsive, and I think he's saying exactly what he knows. Yeah, that social media was being manipulated, that fake news was being disseminated, and that Brexit happened, that a lot of the money going into Brexit and a lot of the people behind Brexit were also contributing to the Trump campaign. It's not an accident that both of these things happened, and it's not an accident that he just happened to say, you'll be calling me Mr. Brexit. So let's think a little bit about the defenses of the ego. So like I was saying before, when your ego starts to get a little bit vulnerable, it needs to defend itself. It doesn't want to be deflated. It doesn't want to be taken down. One of the main defenses of the ego is regression, when we kind of drop back to a younger age state within ourselves. You go back to the Twitter feed, and we have words like loser, dumb, dummy, terrible, stupid, weak, dope, or dopey. The guy's 70 years old, and these are the words that he's using, most of the time. Kind of like an 8 or 9-year-old child in a playground. This is the level of insult. Acting out, another ego defense, when instead of kind of taking something on board and working through some sort of conflict, we just kind of respond and act. So the National Monument in Utah, he reduced by a huge, I think there was a second one as well, huge amount. And he did this, well, again, it's kind of speculation, but the national monuments that he reduced in size were national monuments that President Barack Obama set up. So part of his presidency has been a step-by-step dismantling of all of the things that Obama did. You might know that Obama taunted him at the big press dinner and really shamed him in front of everyone. A lot of people think this might have been the moment where Trump really decided in his head, I'm going to get you. And you can see a lot of his policy decisions, if you can call them as such, have really little to do with the policy, but they have a lot to do with that, I'm going to get you back 10 times more. And that's what's really scary about him, because it stops being about the content of the policy and it starts being about the content of the action. Denial, pretending not to know something about yourself, another ego defense. We know that there's been denial, if not lying, about his own net worth. He's settled tens, if not scores, of lawsuits against people that he's scammed in Trump University and a whole variety of other things. His business acumen, which we understand from people who've really looked into it, how good is he at business, how many of his businesses have failed, in reversing of previous choices. He used to be a Democrat, Trump, not anymore. And this is the denial of saying one thing and then saying another thing. The previous thing just kind of disappears. The Access Hollywood tapes, you might remember, where he used that rather unfortunate expression about groping women, he recently dismissed as being fake news. So not only did he apologize for having said it when the tapes came out, now it's fake. So you can really see, like, there's a break with reality. The media is so after me on women. Wow, this is a tough business. Nobody has more respect for women than Donald Trump. Okay, I said it, I didn't say it, and I'm the least racist person in the world, and I respect women more than anybody else. The concept of global warming was created by and for the Chinese in order to make US manufacturing non-competitive. Okay, denial. Yeah, because you have to really be in a depressive position to accept global warming or climate change, don't you? And you really have to take some responsibility for some pretty scary stuff. But if you can kind of wrap it up nicely and blame somebody else, you're kind of off the hook. Snowing in Texas and Louisiana, record-setting freezing temperatures throughout the country and beyond, global warming is an expensive hoax. Now we'll start to get a little bit into the group stuff, yeah? I mean, what a relief, yeah? It's a hoax set up by China, it's a hoax, I don't have to worry about it, I don't have to worry about plastics in the ocean. You know, to have a leader let you off the hook for your own responsibility is also pretty great, right? So people do want to let go of responsibility when they're looking at this stuff. Projection. This is when I project onto you either some unconscious thoughts of myself that I'm unable to accept. So this is the Gold Star General. This is the son who got murdered. This is the parent of the son who got murdered in Iraq, I think. I can't remember. Yeah. I was viciously attacked by Mr. Khan at the Democratic Convention. Am I not allowed to respond? Hillary voted for the Iraq War, not me. Sorry, I got a little bit lost in my context there. These are the people on MSNBC who are sort of the more left-wing version of Fox. And he says, I heard poorly rated Morning Joe speaks badly of me. I don't watch anymore. Then how come low IQ crazy Mika along with Psycho Joe came to Mar-a-Lago 3 nights in a row around New Year's Eve and insisted on joining me. She was bleeding badly from a facelift. I said no. There's actually quite a lot going on these two tweets. So these are two news journalists who are pretty bad on Trump. They're not his biggest fans. So he rates them as poorly rated, therefore not important. They speak badly of me. He doesn't watch anymore, so they're poorly rated, and I don't care about them anyway. Low IQ. Trump has the highest IQ in the world. Yeah, they have low IQ. They're crazy. They're psycho. So what is being projected about one's internal world onto somebody else? And then, you know, they want to be part of my party, but I said no. They can't join my party. We're back to this kind of 8-year-old playground thinking level. And she was bleeding badly from a facelift. Okay? So he also wants to attack her on her vanity. Yeah? And it's really important for him to show these people as bad, sad, and vain. When we bring together impulsivity, the access to share that impulsivity, and we want to wonder about what they're impulsively talking about, what's being projected. Fantasy. This is an escape from reality, another ego defense. Millions voted illegally. That's why Hillary's popular vote was more than his. Obama wiretapped Trump Tower, and the largest audience ever to witness an inauguration, he says. Flights into fantasy. In addition to winning the Electoral College in a landslide, I won the popular vote if you deduct the millions of people who voted illegally. Okay, no evidence that millions of people voted illegally. So we see the use of fantasy as an ego defense to deny reality and maintain the sense of self. Congratulations to Fox News for being #1 in inauguration ratings. They were many times higher than fake news, CNN. Public is smart. Yeah, one thing becomes real and one thing becomes unreal. I'm going to save Social Security without any cuts. I know where to get the money. Nobody else does. Okay? Same idea as I'm going to build the wall and the Mexicans are going to pay for it. It's pure fantasy. Pure fantasy. The tax bill that was just passed is pure fantasy. Unfortunately, it was passed, so we're going to see how a pure fantasy bill rolls out in real life. Splitting, very similar to paranoid schizoid positioning. It's when we make one thing good and one thing bad. We see his splitting in a lot of his policy decisions in the Muslim ban, the Great Mexican Wall. Repeal and replace, okay? Repeal and replace is what we understand to be the repeal of the Affordable Care Act, also known as Obamacare. Okay, you have a healthcare act, which is a little bit faulty, needs some fixing. So why does it have to be repeal and replace? Yeah? Shouldn't it be like, let's keep the good bits and work on the bad bits? Isn't that like what a reasonable approach would be? We pass the legislation, some of it isn't fitting. No, repeal and replace, it's about getting rid of Obama's legacy. It's a personal attack. Same with birtherism. Obama wasn't born. He's not a real American. He's got to be from somewhere else. I can't bear the reality, his reality, so I've got to create a fantasy. Great solidarity for our national anthem and our country. Standing with locked arms is good. Kneeling is not acceptable. Bad ratings. He's talking about the football players who were not standing for the national anthem, largely because of the racism in the country in Charlottesville. We see the splitting here. Great, good, bad. There's one side and there's another side. End of story. Having a good relationship with Russia is a good thing, not a bad thing. Only stupid people or fools would think that it's bad. Yeah, again. So it's not a matter of opinion. Yeah, this is not a Democrat-Republican thing. This is not left and right. This is good and bad. Yeah, it's a very, very different thing. You might be more of a free markets person, you might be more of a socialist, then you can have an engagement about what policy decision is best for a given country. But this is good and bad, yeah, like evil and good. Rationalization. I'm a very calm person, but love tweeting about both scum and positive subjects. Whenever I tweet, some call it a tirade, totally dishonest. Yeah, so he justifies his behavior, yeah? I'm not actually lashing out. After the Las Vegas shootings, this isn't a gun situation. I mean, we could go into it, but it's a little bit too soon to go into it. But fortunately, somebody else has had a gun that was shooting in the opposite direction. Otherwise, it would have been, as bad as it would have been much worse. But this is a mental health problem at the highest level. It's a very sad event, okay? It's a justification that this was about a gun, yeah? And you can see the kind of rings that he's running to justify. There is some, I don't really know about dementia very much, but there is some very interesting speculation also that the way in which he speaks might be representative of how people speak in the early stages of dementia, talking around words, using smaller words, using less complex words. So there might be something else going on there, which isn't just about splitting. It might be more serious. I really don't know, but you listen to the way he used words like thing and that and good and beautiful a lot. It's not the way that he spoke 20 or 30 years ago. Something has kind of shifted quite substantially. Then he attacks Meryl Streep, one of the most overrated actresses in Hollywood. She said some bad things about him at the Oscars, calls her a Hillary flunky. Again, he takes to Twitter to defend himself against a Hollywood actress who's speaking at the Oscars. So we're just looking again at what is a priority for this man. Intellectualization is another defense of the ego. I couldn't think of any examples to use for Donald Trump because he's not much of an intellectual. So we'll just have to skip that one for now. We're going to start moving on to social issues here. What is the Trump effect on society? There is an appeal to crowds. I talked a little bit about this. So confirmation bias and identification. So if there's certain things about the world that we want to hear back, we will confirm that and we will look for more of that. If, for example, climate change makes us anxious, this is an opportunity to feel a little bit less anxious. If we're feeling under-empowered, we might identify with the person in power and wish that we were him. Emotional contagion. This happens, in football stadiums and that sort of thing. It also happens across social networks. So people are getting riled up and excited, and that's kind of doubling and doubling and doubling. So people are really getting behind an idea. Easy answers to complex problems. Falling back to the paranoid schizoid position can be pretty uncomfortable, but it can also be a relief, again, because you don't have to occupy that gray area, those areas of conflict. Lots of people who have quite good reason to feel pretty angry at the system can get behind a man who wants to dismantle that system, no matter how he goes about doing that. Hope in a transitional object, so like maybe this will kind of be the Messiah figure that will make things better for us. The enormous power of disavowal. So disavowal is a little bit, it's like denial light, yeah? It's kind of like pretending not to know, yeah? And we can get some relief in sort of disavowing the complex issues that are going on in the world and seeking simple answers. I just want to, before I finish, want to talk a little bit about social media, because social media also has a role. Trump himself said, "I doubt I would be here if it weren't for social media," to be honest with you. I think that there is some truth to that. Part of that has to do with lots of these things that we're talking about before, because it also mediates emotional contagion. But we're also finding out more and more that there's some intention going on in the social media too. The spreading of fake news, the bots, that are going around spreading the news and liking things. The media is really the word, one of the greatest of all terms I've come up with is fake. He concedes, I guess people have used it, or perhaps over the years, but I've never noticed it. He's basically saying that he came up with the word fake news. He invented it. Now, I think it's really interesting that he states this, because I think it's like, soon you'll be calling me Mr. Brexit. Like, what does he know about fake news in which he's taking responsibility for it? Does that make any sense? Like, why have such an obsession about coining the term, it's not even a term, fake news? Yeah, unless you had some kind of investment in fake news. And he uses it a lot, usually to denigrate actual news. But is there any awareness about kind of the machines that are going on creating it as well? I don't know the answer to that question. I feel like I sound like a conspiracy theorist half the time when I talk about Trump, and I'm not one of those guys, but one does wonder. When people say something false, I attack those people. When people make mistakes, I correct them. So just also really briefly, technology is mediating the way that we engage with each other on a huge scale these days. A lot of what's going on here is pretty innocent. A lot of it has to do with algorithms that we don't quite know how they work. And then we also know that there's a pretty good deal of influence and manipulation that's going on as well. So there's kind of an undermining of fact. Yeah? Do we know that the news that we're getting is right? And how much news are we getting through these mediating factors? In a Trump effect environment, I think it's something that we need to be really very, very thoughtful about. I think this is the final slide. Yeah. So Trump's biographer notes that dark times are times of great opportunity for people of great stealth. Trump said himself, "I'll wait for bad times, and when bad times come, I'll get whatever I want." Now, this is a really interesting thing, because he was talking about Trump Tower, and he was talking about New York in the 1970s. Now, I don't know if anybody in this room is familiar with what New York was like in the 1970s. Just watch some old Al Pacino films, and you'll get a sense of it. It was pretty run down. It was pretty dangerous. It was pretty crime-ridden. And that was the moment that he started building. Yeah, that was when he got into real estate. Whether that was by savvy or by luck, I don't know, but it was during a period in which the government was also funding new projects to regenerate areas. And I think that was a huge lesson for Donald Trump. Yeah? When shit's going bad, that's where the opportunity lies. And I think he was able to take advantage of that in the last election, and I think we will see what comes next. So that's the end of the lecture. If anybody has any questions or comments, we have about 20 minutes to have a chat.
Any thoughts what kind of social environment, what kind of society makes this type of character, allows this character to come on stage, or psychologically speaking?
So what I didn't do, I didn't read his biography. because in a sense, that's sort of what they did with the Goldwater guy. They found out about the father and they found out about the mother, and they said, presumably this is what created that character. I think we can know quite a lot about what's happening in the here and now. I don't know how, well, it's dangerous, right? Because it's very easy to draw a narrative about the dismissive father in the overbearing mother to create a character. I think it's always an unpredictable mix that looks like a very clear narrative retrospectively. So I think that there's almost always something essentially inbuilt that will proclive someone to moving one way or the other way. So you might have two people coming through an identical familial environment, one of whom develops a false self, narcissistic personality like this. His brother, I think his brother killed himself. He was an alcoholic and he killed himself. I'll double check that before you include that in the recording. But two members of the family who experience themselves in completely different ways. And that's what the really interesting thing is, both about character and ego defense, that your ego will very creatively find a solution to a problem, but that solution isn't necessarily predictable. Yeah? So I could probably, if I did go and read his biography, I could probably give you a pretty sexy story about how he became how he did because of what he was subjected to, but I think I wouldn't trust that story because you couldn't see it coming. I don't know if that answers your question, but. Yeah?
Yeah, thanks so much for that. Sometimes with Twitter, the temptation is to think that it's kind of a representation of somebody's internal mental state. It's the way in which people post on it. It's literally a kind of thought they've just had because of the previous 140 character limit and that sort of thing. But with a lot of these tweets that you read out, I couldn't help feeling, and I think this goes back to the guy at front's question, that he's saying things with an instrumental sort of value in the sense that he's trying to elicit certain affects and emotions in his fan base, in his followers. And it seems, I don't know, I'd be tempted to say that we should be careful about thinking that it's just a direct representation of what he's thinking. He seems to be purposely baiting and saying things that people, all of these lots of negative kind of affects within the general collective populace, he's giving them a sort of spark which is going to ignite a lot of rage. So yeah, I don't know, I mean, I was pretty convinced by what you were saying, but also, I don't know, I'm also a little bit, I think there's something else going on in the picture, in that he's kind of purposely positioning himself with respect, and some of the quotes at the end that the last one actually, I mean, it shows a kind of a degree of self-reflection that's quite astonishing. You might wait for bad times to come and then they get what they want. I mean, that doesn't seem to be the sort of thing that would resonate on Twitter in the same way.
Oh, that's not a tweet, yeah. Yeah.
Immediately, it seems to be very reflective and self-aware in quite a sinister way. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point, and I certainly wouldn't kind of make a defense that by reading his tweets we get an insight, into the parts of his unconscious mind that, would be really interesting to get off an analyst's couch. But I do think there's a lot of evidence, in my personal opinion, that he is driven by the impulse and that he is driven by the splash, for sure. And I think that is the first drive. Yeah. So what I'm hearing you saying is that maybe there's a kind of intention there to rile the base, or maybe there's a kind of, finesse. But I think that there's a lucky convergence between his impulsivity and the splash that he makes. And I was talking to you guys about it earlier, I kind of fault reality television for that, of which he was a big part. That in a sense, you vote for the person who you want to be the winner, and you vote for the person who's the most entertaining. And I think that's how he became president, because he was definitely the most entertaining one. And when you think about that feedback loop, if he wants to entertain, he can do that pretty easily by just being impulsive. But I expect there's a lot more going on that we have no access to. There was a question over here and then in the back.
Yeah, I was just wondering about the black and white split that you talked about with kind of schizoid.
Mm-hmm.
But how would you say that that differs from the black and white perception of the borderline condition? Because I've heard it more related to borderline.
Yeah, I mean, so schizoid, just to be clear with everyone, it means split. That's the derivation of the meaning of the word schizoid. Something is split off. In borderline personality disorder you're talking about. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a much bigger conversation, but I think there's definitely an overlap on that. So you can see in the Kleinian model, you can see borderline personality manifestation as being able to occupy the depressive position and then falling off it very quickly due to some kind of a trigger. So if you're unfamiliar with what borderline phenomenon is, it's usually when someone can become very, very emotional in response to what other people might see as being a slight or a misunderstanding. Like that they can become self-harming, they can have psychotic moments. And they're two kind of slightly different principles, but at its very base, you see that kind of the incapacity to hold the depressive position, the gray area, in the world turns suddenly, and then it can turn back again. The difference is that in the borderline state, you're not necessarily seeing everything else as being ideal. Everything is kind of a struggle still, and then you fall off the cliff. So that's quite a big difference. I'm not sure if that answers your question. Yeah.
And it also has to do with the triggers.
Yeah, so what happens is rather than being able to perceive a trigger as a bump in the road or a moment of conflict, it becomes paranoid schizoid. You want to destroy me, you want to leave me, it's all over. I'm worthless, or you're worthless. So it's definitely in that kind of, that area, that paranoid schizoid area. Yeah?
I wanted to say, I lived in New York for 18 years starting in 1978, and Trump was in the news frequently, and he was like a joke. And nobody took him seriously, and we couldn't believe that he went national and that he won.
Yeah.
He was like, and he was like Teflon man, nothing stuck to him, and that's still going on because he's managed to turn everybody against him. I mean, with all these tweets and that, he's pretty much attacked everybody, like he's doing his system. And it's surprising that he's still there. I'm wondering, how long it's going to work, this Teflon thing we have, is able to stay there.
It's a really interesting phenomenon that I'm curious about, because what you see is you see a ball start rolling down the hill with him. There were big projects, but smaller projects than being a president, for example. And for some, maybe this is where there's a kind of cleverness that I can't quite wrap my head around. How he manages to get the people around him to respond in particular ways that seem to level up every single time. Yeah, so it might be Trump Tower, and the next it's Atlantic City, which is a much bigger thing. Totally failed casino that he seems to come out, fine out of. Then goes on to television, also finds himself sort of building, it's almost like you can't fault him for seeing the world in a faulty way, because his local world will respond to him in what I would see as a faulty way. So it's always a confirmation, isn't it? Until right up at the top. Oh, sorry.
Politicians are supposed to make connections with other people and deals, and he turns everybody against him in every single issue, which is astonishing. He's like a reverse politician, like a mafia boss surrounded with his family, but he doesn't do, what politicians usually do. And
I think what's happening is that the public is finding it spooky, yeah? Because the public couldn't imagine it happening, and then we see it happening, and then we see what that manifestation is doing, and I think it's very, very difficult to understand how you see the whole Republican Party, for example, getting behind power. And it's really, I'll come to your question in just a second. It's really interesting. He will speak to a convention center full of evangelical Christians who will perceive Trump as being Christian enough in that sense, because he is a door into that power and influence. So they will excuse him his non-Christianness, and in a sense give him enough Christianness to get behind it. So there's something very seductive about that level of power, where lots of people around will do similar kinds of things. Okay, I will disavow the fact that I don't believe in divorce and this guy's been married 3 times. And I will see him as being a good Christian because this is good for our cause. There's lots of compromises I think people are making. Yeah.
Yeah, that's actually also part of what I wanted to ask you. First, thank you for your talk. It was very very informative. And
Thank you.
I was wondering. It's hard for me to talk English. Sorry.
That's okay. Take your time.
I was wondering, like, if you see if it could be a hidden agenda like this, you know, like he is the mafia boss, which actually has the power, because his agenda seems to be where he succeeds, having power and success. No matter what else is going on, no matter what the media is doing or what the Twitter is doing, or no matter what he says, he actually reaches seems to reach what he wants to reach. But then also he has all these personalities which you displayed, being also a victim or reacting to whatever's happening. But his main agenda, if the main agenda is power and success, then that's actually seeming to unfortunately grow.
Well, I mean, it's a really interesting point, because I think that's the very nature of the tragedy. Yeah, it's a really good point, because I'm actually reconsidering something here. Like I just realized how sad it makes me, actually, because he's not okay. Yeah, like I think when we look at these tweets, he's very distressed. Yeah, he is monitoring criticism about him all the time. He's got to be in one of the most frustrating jobs in the world, in which you're always having to push against other people's self-interest. The tax thing was the first bit of legislation he was able to push through. Everything else was an executive order. I think he's deeply, deeply unhappy and distressed most of the time. That's why he watches Fox and Friends, because it's like a drink. Yeah, it's like, I'm going to tell you exactly what you want to hear about yourself. I think it's why, if there's anything going on with the Russians and with Putin, very, very easy to just kind of pat this guy in the back and make him feel good about himself. But if we want to use Trump to learn about ourselves or learn about mental distress, you see what happens when you manifest the destiny of your false self. Yeah? You get fucking everything you want. And you're still as fucking miserable as you were at day one, because you're manifesting something that's not a direct reflection of a kind of, I don't want to say real self, but sort of a more fuller, authentic representation of, all the different parts of you. Like, success and money is going to be it, but success and money will never, ever feed that beast. He's always at risk. If he's, if he is tweeting this morning that Alec Baldwin, is a tragic, mimic of him on Saturday Night Live, that's not coming from a place of strength and self-security, is it? So, yeah, I think he's very distressed, despite you being absolutely right. He has reached the pinnacle of probably everything he would have wanted.
Thank you.
Yeah. That was a really good question. Yeah. It's a little bit like what a midlife crisis is about, in a sense, achieving everything you thought you wanted and then thinking, well, what am I doing now? Masha?
So in the situations when a trauma happens during the childhood, and I don't want to guess whether it happened in his case or not, we do tend to meet people whose capacities to mentalize vary and sometimes they just shut down. And this is the way in which they can keep these opposite ideas in their mind at the same time. What I wonder is, how does that resonate with US population? What is it, maybe you can tell us your point of view, what is it that is so flirting with them and somehow getting to them? Why is that the case? What has happened during their childhood so they can keep his opposite ideas at the same time in their minds?
Well, so it's a particular part of the population, yeah? A big part of the population is disgusted, and another part of the population is enamored. And the power of an archetypal figure, which I hate to give him that, that kind of, I don't know, call him an archetype. So I stated my bias at the beginning, and maybe it's just impossible for me to think him savvy enough to be like doing this, yeah? For me, it feels like this like convergence of very bad luck, yeah? So you have a guy who's impulsive, you have a guy who's narcissistic, you have a guy who a huge chunk of the population knows through things like the World Wrestling Federation, you know, through through Vegas and through Atlantic City, through the Apprentice. He has recognition. He has a name that he's able to sell for lots of money. So he has a kind of inborn respect for some, and he unabashedly, impulsively gives conventional politics the finger every day. Yeah, he's flipping off the government, and I think for a lot of people want to do that. Yeah, a lot of people are really unhappy and really disappointed, and in a sense don't give a shit about where his politics are. They just want him to upend the status quo, and they want it to be entertaining. And I think he is entertaining. He is upending the status quo. You could even argue that he is standing behind some of his campaign promises. Yeah, he said he was going to do stuff that no other president would do, and you know, he's done it again this morning. So people probably think he's a man of his word. He also says so many things in contrast to each other that your own confirmation bias might just say, okay, well, you know, I'll take this one, this one, this one, this one, and he represents my needs. So I think
We need to educate population how to hear and how to fight their own biases.
See, this is why it's an uphill battle, yeah? In order to confront our own biases, in order to be in our own depressive position, we have to feel impacted by other people, and that has to hurt. Yeah, so if I think I'm right and you think I'm right, and we just go back and forth, nothing happens. But if I think, oh my gosh, you might be right, and I have to come down a peg, and then you have to do the same thing, it hurts. You know, you don't get to be right. You don't get to be ideal. You have to be challenged, and this is what we're asking the public to do. It's the same thing with Brexit. You know, it's like they're wrong and we're right, and I don't want to. It's repeal and replace. Yeah, it's lazy thinking, and people will move to lazy thinking to feel better about themselves. They don't have to worry about the environment. So how do we educate people to allow themselves to be impacted by others in a way that's going to feel bad for them, so that we live in a better world where people are impacting each other in a positive way? I think it's a really tough one. I think it's kind of what good psychotherapy and psychoanalysis should be about, but psychoanalysts also like to be right, you know, about their kind of psychoanalysis and another kind of psychoanalysis. One last question or comment?
I was thinking about the collusion that you seem to touch upon, the collusion of the other towards the impulsive, in this case, person.
Mm-hmm.
But could you elaborate a bit more about this faulty response?
Like the people around him.
Right, and perhaps expand a bit in a more other context of interpersonal situations. What would be the ideal way of dealing with impulsivity? Like, not to feed it. So.
Yes, okay. I mean, so first of all, I find it really difficult. Yeah, like I find it difficult to understand how people aren't saying, I don't want to be a part of this. Some people have, but how how there can be an infrastructure that feeds that impulsive beast. And the only thought that comes to mind is all of our own kind of sociopathic parts that, in a sense, does a logical conclusion that says, okay, the balance has now, this guy has been completely awful, and nobody's been interested, and he's a racist, and he's impulsive, and he's obviously stuff going on. And then actually he's going to be president. So I need to think quite sociopathically about what I need to do in order to save my political career, to save the party, to be all right. So I think it becomes, there might be, particularly around the politicians, there's a survival mechanism there. There's a way to power, there's a way to wealth. It happened here, it happens in lots of different places where you see the tips of balance change, and you make a decision to get behind it. And when you're dealing with someone like this, now fortunately, at least not yet, he's not in a position to have a night of the long knives. You stand up against this guy and you're out. But this is a guy who will pummel you 100 times if you step the wrong way. And I think people are really scared of being pummeled. I was just listening to the radio today, and a Mexican-American guy, if he was kicked out of a press conference really early on, he said, go back to Univision, the Mexican television channel. Does anybody see this? He was actually taken out of the press conference by a bodyguard, and they were interviewing him today. And he really wanted to get his answers out of the president, so he sent a memo to the White House saying, I would appreciate it if you'd answer the questions you wouldn't let me ask. And he had his mobile phone number on this memo, which Trump either tweeted or published publicly, and this guy was hounded. People were calling and attacking him. I think it can be really scary to be that close to this kind of a personality. So, yeah, fear and the desire for power and the desire for safety. But I don't fully understand it. I look at them and I don't understand how perfectly smart people can spend their lives defending what I think is just terrible stuff. Yeah, sorry, that was a little bit of a downer to finish on. But we'll finish, yeah?